Tonight on Talking Politics, the debate over debates in the general election as two top Democrats sidestep requests from their Republican opponents. We'll dig into the pros and cons of that approach for the candidates and the voters they're vying to serve. But first, the national debate over immigration policy was thrust into our backyard this week, literally when two planes with around 50 migrants on board landed in Martha's Vineyard, sent by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who opted to also pass along some exclusive footage to Fox News. Their arrival was a surprise not just to the state government or the residents of the island, but to the migrants, too, who were reportedly told they'd be going to Boston, where they were promised better jobs and housing. In a statement, DeSantis' office said the flights were part of the state's relocation program, which sends migrants to, quote, sanctuary destinations. Joining me to discuss are GBH News reporter Sarah Betancourt, who's been covering this story very closely, and senior political editor Peter Kadzis. Thank you both for being here. Sarah, what happened or is happening on Martha's Vineyard might have surprised a lot of people, but there were signs that this was coming in retrospect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, Adam, thanks for having me. And yeah, you're 100% right. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been saying for months that he would be sending migrants north. That's why he proposed $8 million in the Florida budget back in, I believe it was May, and ended up getting $12 million to do it. And meanwhile, you have Texas Governor Greg Abbott sending 8,500 people north since April to D.C. and then more recently New York City and Chicago, wanting to send them to sanctuary jurisdictions and get them away from Texas. So there's a strong anti-immigrant sentiment from these governors without really designating who the immigrants are, why they're coming here, and how international humanitarian law allows for people to claim asylum.
And you reported earlier this week, I believe, that migrants who'd been sent north from Texas were already finding their way to hospitals in the Boston area, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. So we'd received several tips from staff at Boston Children's Hospital. And as a result, we were able to confirm that several Boston hospitals have seen more migrants from South and Central America having come through Texas. And Tufts Medical Center chief ER doctor actually confirmed that they were coming from the New York City bus. And those migrants are up in Boston because they might have a connection to Boston, or also because New York City is just overflowing and they need help. So their first instinct is to go to a hospital and seek it.
Peter Kadzis, as Sarah just pointed out, this is part of a bigger push by Republicans to send migrants north to blue states. I want to just read a little bit of a statement that Ron DeSantis' office provided to explain what they were doing, get you to weigh in on it. A spokesperson for DeSantis said on Wednesday, states like Massachusetts, New York, and California will better facilitate the care of these individuals who they have invited into our country by incentivizing illegal immigration. With the caveat that we don't necessarily know the immigration status of the people who've arrived in Martha's Vineyard, is there any reason to think that blue state policies involving immigration are a draw for people who are immigrating to the country? Or does that not add up?
Adam, let me start by saying don't confuse any hardball political analysis I offer here with a lack of sympathy for the Venezuelans who've been hijacked to this country. First of all, people who migrate, try to immigrate to the United States, do so to come to this nation, not an individual state. And I would offer as proof of that the interviews with the scores of Venezuelans who said they had never even heard of Massachusetts when they were unwittingly shipped to Martha's Vineyard. Nevertheless, we can't ignore the fact that Donald Trump was elected president in part by his, how to put it, his revolting demonization of immigrants in general. But look at, we're in the middle of a cold civil war, and the Republicans are trying to draw a distinction that is as sharp as possible between friends and enemies. I think when we look back on this incident, we'll see that in Massachusetts, the 2024 presidential election may well have begun on Martha's Vineyard.
Sarah, I want to give you a chance, since you cover immigration for us, a chance to weigh in on this notion that policies crafted in states like Massachusetts draw people to the country, broadly speaking. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think we really need to look at where they're coming from first. So the immigrants who landed on Martha's Vineyard, most of them come from Venezuela. And in Venezuela, you have a dictator, Nicolas Maduro, and his security forces who are responsible for so many extrajudicial executions, short-term disappearances, jailed opponents, prosecuting civilians in military courts, torturing detainees, and cracking down on protesters. These are the kind of conditions people flee from. And when they're coming to the United States, under international humanitarian law, they can claim asylum in, a border state. If they land there, they walk up to a border agent, they can claim it. We don't know a lot about the people who've come here. I just interviewed someone with WCAI reporters Eve Zuckoff, who had come to Texas searching for a better life from Venezuela so he could send funds back home. And he had intended to go to Utah. When he got on the planes, he was told he would go to Oregon or potentially New York City. So he didn't really know what was going on. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we talk about this.
Yeah, that does seem like a really important point, and I'm glad both of you made it. Peter, Governor Baker sent out a statement, if my timing is right, Thursday afternoon, about 24 hours before the arrivals in Martha's Vineyard began. He thanked people for helping respond to the situation. He talked about how care possibly was going to be provided for the migrants at a military base on Cape Cod. And apparently, as we talk right now, that is in the works. That's being implemented. He also said this: the Commonwealth has many resources for assisting individuals that arrive in Massachusetts with varying immigration statuses and needs, and is working with all partners involved to make sure those resources are available to the migrants that arrived last night. What struck me about that was, well, obviously, tonally, it's a completely different way of talking about migrants than what we hear from Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott. There was no reference in the governor's statement to Ron DeSantis, his fellow Republican governor, and there was no condemnation of using the forced or misleading or forced and misleading transport of humans as a way to score political points. Peter, Governor Baker has lamented time and time again growing incivility in politics. He's not shy about making that point in the abstract. Wouldn't a little more outrage from him in this particular situation have been appropriate?
Before I answer that question, Adam, I want to add a footnote to Sarah's answer.
Okay.
In terms of Florida politics, DeSantis might have somewhat shot himself in the foot because Venezuelan immigrants, legal immigrants, dominate southern Florida politics. But that's a discussion for a different
That's
time.
An interesting point. Yeah, what about Governor Baker's muted tone?
Yeah, let's listen. Remember when Barack Obama was called No Drama Obama?
I do.
Well, Charlie Baker is boring Baker. He speaks with the passion of a town manager. For Baker, actions speak louder than words. And yesterday, he immediately dispatched his Human Services Secretary, Mary Lou Sutter, to Martha's Vineyard. That was a good move. And as you just noted, the Venezuelans are in the process of being relocated to a military base. But as for the issue of passion, for starters, Adam, Congressman Bill Keating, who represents the Cape and the Islands, had nothing but praise for Baker, and he's a Democrat. Outrage would not have been out of order. I agree with you there. But off-the-cuff outrage is not Baker's thing. Remember when Trump was first elected and the press hounded Baker to denounce him? Baker took his time and is now one of the nation's leading anti-Trumpers. So I'll leave it for the audience to make up their mind.
I'm glad you made that point about Keating. It's interesting because, and it was Keating, right? You said who had praise
Yes.
for the governor, because I believe it was a tweet from him that made a point along the lines of history has not tended to look kindly on humans who were transported as cargo, or on the transport of humans as cargo. I hope I'm giving credit where it's due with that tweet. Let me ask you, Peter.
You are.
Okay, good. Let me ask you about one other political name and the way they're weighing in. My understanding from our friend Lisa Kaczynski over at Politico is that Maura Healey's gubernatorial campaign has been directing queries about what's happening in Martha's Vineyard to the Attorney General's office. She is, of course, the sitting Attorney General, which is providing sort of technical, muted Baker-esque commentary on what's happening. Doesn't Maura Healey, as the Democratic candidate for governor, the presumptive winner of this race, she has a huge lead over Jeff Deal, doesn't she have a little more latitude to speak? Maybe not more latitude. Isn't it weird that she's not speaking out more forcefully? Because unlike Baker, she can be very, very passionate when it comes to her public pronouncements. So what's going on there?
Adam, I think you have to remember, and I'm going to wag my finger a bit, Maura Healey is now a Baker Democrat.
Yeah. And
so she's taking lessons from the master who has held office for 8 consecutive years here.
Good point. Sarah Betancourt, do you think that this is going to be sort of an anomalous, and for the individuals involved, maybe a very traumatic week in Massachusetts politics, but something that you know, it becomes past history pretty quickly? Or is this a harbinger of more such, I don't even know what to call them, shipments sounds too callous, forced conveyance, more use of humans to score political points by Republicans with their ultimate destination being here in Massachusetts? Are we going to see this again?
Well, I do want to address something that Peter said.
Sure.
On Maura Healey's front, and it will melt into your question, Adam. On Maura Healey's front, I think part of her reservations right now are these concerns about whether or not federal or state criminal laws were violated in the transport under false pretenses of these immigrants. Mm-hmm. That's something her office looks into very often. They have a human trafficking division and look into that. And so she might also be wearing her AG cap more than her gubernatorial candidate hat in this situation. And as for the future, I mean, do I think there will be more planes? If there weren't these allegations about human trafficking and kidnapping and potential lawsuits, I would say yes, because Ron DeSantis has about $12 million to continue shipping people north. And Abbott, yesterday, he issued a statement pretty much using this situation on Martha's Vineyard as a rallying cry for other border state governors. So I really do think it is going to continue, and it's something that Massachusetts should be prepared for in the coming months. Okay,
we got to leave it there. Sarah Betancourt, Peter Kadzis, thank you both. Next up, to debate or not to debate for the Republican nominees running for key state offices, the answer is simple. Debate as many times as possible, but for the Democratic nominees, it is a lot more complicated. In the race for governor, Jeff Deal is challenging Maura Healey to 3 debates before Election Day. So far, she's agreed to just 1. And in the Attorney General race, Jay McMahon is calling for 7 debates, roughly 1 a week. But at this point, Andrea Campbell thinks 1 is enough, specifically one that already happened in Worcester last month with candidates from both parties ahead of the primary. And technically, by the way, that was a forum in which the candidates weren't supposed to engage each other directly. As for future ones, GBH News has pressed her on that several times this week, and each time the answer is more or less the same.
What I'm focused on right now is, 1, thanking all the people who did the hard work of getting us across the finish line. And let me tell you, I'm still doing thank you calls. And then getting back out into communities. So when we said we'll see, it depends on what those other priorities are. I will say we'll see again. I will stress that folks should watch that debate.
So when it comes to debates, what, if anything, do candidates in big races owe the public? And if the public does have a right to expect debates, can candidates effectively forfeit it with extreme messaging or behavior? I'm joined now by Tammy Vigil, Senior Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Media Science at Boston University, and Mike Dean, co-author of the daily newsletter from Axios Boston. Thank you both for being here to talk this through. Mike, let's start with you. What is your take on what, in races like this, big statewide races, candidates owe their opponents and the public when it comes to debating?
is certainly the norm. The status quo would be at least a few debates. Two or three is typical for governor, U.S. Senate, things like that. I know you and I have been involved in things like that before. But there is an aversion to this, and it could be kind of the politics of the moment. It could be because it could be advantageous to these Republican opponents who want to really, call out these Democratic nominees on certain issues. We can definitely see what Republicans can, have to win and what Democrats have to lose by kind of overexposure on a debate stage. But what voters need to do really is to vet these Democrats. I mean, if there is a overwhelming advantage and likelihood that most of these Democrats are going to be in office come January, and voters don't quite know what to think of a lot of them, and that's really who's going to lose out here.
Tammy, you and I talked about this earlier this week when I was doing a wrap-up of the various things that we've heard from the various candidates. I know you have a bit of a different take than Mike. What do you think candidates' obligation to debate their opponents is, if any?
But I think that candidates have an obligation to provide information and to be able to provide contrasts between themselves and their opponents. Whether or not a debate format is the most appropriate and effective way to do that depends on the two candidates that are involved and whether or not they're willing to engage in good faith in the debates. And we know that that's not always the case. We've seen that usually in out-of-state. We haven't seen much of that in the in-state debates, but we have seen that in a lot of different kinds of debates across the country, and especially in the last presidential round where there was a lack of good faith, and that didn't exactly help inform the public in the way that we would have hoped it would.
When you say lack of good faith, what specifically are you thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking about folks who are willing to come to the stage well-informed and talk about the issues and to share real information that is viable, that is verifiable, and to actually debate based on facts and on perspectives rather than simply trying to create a spectacle. And we saw that particularly in the U.S. presidential debates in 2020, where it was really more about creating spectacle, which helped us to learn about the candidates in different kinds of ways, but it didn't really help inform the electorate in the way that most debates are intended to do.
Tammy, one more follow-up question for you. If what candidates owe the public is a clear, concise explanation of where they stand on key issues, can we trust them to provide that on their own if they're not being pushed by, for example, a debate moderator? Because, as you know, a lot of political messaging tends to be a little bit squishy. There are elisions. There are things spun in the most favorable possible way as opposed to a potentially more negative way. So aren't we asking a lot of candidates, maybe an unrealistic amount, if we expect them to do that for us?
Well, we would like to hope that they would do it in most of their messaging, that they'd be honest, sincere, well-informed. But we know that it always helps when they can be pushed a bit by somebody. If they can't debate because they don't think that it's going to be occurring in good faith, then I think that the second best way to kind of get at this would be a moderated town hall event in which they are answering questions directly by the public themselves. And so you have somebody who's moderating that's going to help push them, and the public gets to ask the questions that they want answers to. So I think that would be a secondary kind of way to accomplish a similar kind of ideal if you can't actually have a fair debate or an effective debate.
Mike Dean, one of the statewide races where, and tell me if I'm wrong here, my understanding is it's not clear whether there will be any debate in the Secretary of State race, where we've got Bill Galvin, who's been in office for a remarkable 7 terms and is seeking an even more remarkable 8th term in office, running against Rayla Campbell, who is a hard right Republican. Campbell suggested in her speech at the Mass GOP convention earlier this year that 5-year-olds in Massachusetts are being taught to perform oral sex on each other. She was not really able to back up that outlandish claim. Some of her own party members distanced themselves from her comments. And in June, she rolled up to the public library in Holbrook, Massachusetts, to disrupt a drag queen story hour. Let's take a little bit of a look at how that went down.
We would love for this to end. We would love for this to end. Our taxpayer dollars
very clear.
Yeah, and you should see the books. Oh, I'm hateful and bigoted about the books that show child pornography that are available in this library.
Where? Show me the child pornogaphy available.
Why don't you read Gender Queer? I've already been showing everybody about it. Or how about let's talk about it? Let's talk about it. I'm protecting children.
If this is not protecting
I'm protecting children. Nope, I'm protecting children. Is this person been Corey checked? Has this person been Corey checked?
So that, again, is footage that Rayla Campbell filmed of herself going to a drag queen story hour in Holbrook, put up on her Facebook page. Mike, if I were Bill Galvin, I'd be inclined to look at that video, look at clips from the Mass GOP convention, and say, if anyone pressed me on this, no, I'm not going to do that debate. I don't want to subject myself to that sort of treatment. I don't want to foster that kind of rhetoric being put out in the public sphere. You think that'd be a fair position for him to take?
It could be, and it could be something that Galvin and his campaign decide to go through. That is one side of this kind of spectrum that we were talking about before of the good faith versus not that candidates approach these debates with. On the gubernatorial side, certainly that would be a different kind of vibe of what was going on stage, because Jeff Deal's a very different candidate, and Maura Healey is a very different candidate from Bill Galvin. So yeah, if you have radicals like Campbell, it makes sense. Galvin and Campbell would be apples and oranges talking on stage. They wouldn't be even talking about the same things. So it wouldn't make that much sense. A bigger issue here is, what voters want, what voters do, and when they hold them accountable. They're still electing the Democrats. They're still probably going to elect Democrats by huge margins right now. And these politicians will not pay a penalty for ducking debates, whether it's in good faith or not.
Let me ask you a little more, Mike, about the governor's race, because one thing I've wondered is why Maura Healey. I know that she's ahead in the polls and people just expect her to cruise to the nomination. If I imagine her debating Jeff Deal, it seems to me like there are a number of ways where she would effectively be able to say, he's completely out of step with where the people of Massachusetts are. He's out of step when it comes to abortion rights. He's out of step when it comes to what he makes of the direction of the country right now. He's out of step with his claims that the election in 2020 was not fair and that Donald Trump was effectively cheated out of another term in office. I know she's committed to one debate, but why not take 2 or 3 chances to just pound Deal on those points, which I would think would be pretty easy?
Well, like you said, because she has the advantage right now by polling, she's up by a lot. I think one thing that we kind of forget about sometimes is that Republicans think the same thing about Healey a lot of the times. I'm sure Jeff Deal's campaign thinks, well, as soon as we put her on stage and we show people how liberal she is, we show her the progressive positions she's taken, plenty of unenrolleds will come our way. That may or may not be the case.
That's a good point.
They think that that is the road they're trying to go down and trying to build that advantage. They think that they can expose Healey. She's running a fairly moderate campaign for a progressive Democrat. So just, be as on the down low as possible is the game plan.
That's a good reminder to get, because she is very Baker-esque right now in her approach, but there were past statements that she made, for example, involving Black Lives Matter, some violence attached to Black Lives Matter protests that the GOP pushed on repeatedly. She ended up walking those back. So, yeah, you do have 3 debates. That's 3 chances for Jeff Deal to bring those up, for example, as opposed to just 1. Tammy, when you and I talked a couple days ago, you suggested that those of us in the media, not necessarily Mike and I individually, but people such as us, may bear some responsibility for candidates' reluctance to debate, given the way that we tend to cover debates when they occur. Can you describe what you mean there?
Sure. I think that, during the debates themselves, if the citizens are actually watching the debates, they get the information directly and they get to see the content of the debates themselves. But when you look at the coverage of debates after the fact, there often is a lot of tendency to avoid the nuanced discussion of the content and to focus more on things like the gaffes and the errors and the hiccups that happen during and so when people focus on that, the folks who didn't get a chance to watch the debates live or to watch them, somewhere else, they didn't get the opportunity to hear the arguments, to see the nuance, to see that. Instead, what they get is the focus on, who said what incorrectly, or how did somebody slam somebody else, or what good one-liners came out of the debate. And that really does a disservice to the community at large, to voters.
I think I may have written or on the radio provided some such coverage in the past. So it's a good thing to be made mindful of, hopefully.
It's understandable because it's fun, it's interesting, and it grabs attention. And, I always think about it as sort of like the Saturday Night Live effect, because it's the stuff that shows up on the Saturday Night Live skits and it shows up over and over again in those kinds of places. And so it's fun, it's entertaining, it grabs people's attention, and it's very memorable, but that doesn't necessarily help inform the voters.
This, in a way, follows from what you were just talking about. You also mentioned to me, Tammy, that you do think there are some things that you get from watching a candidate in a debate setting going up against their opponent that you can't get elsewhere, as many different ways as there are to get information about a particular candidate or campaign. Can you flesh that out a little bit? What do you get from potentially unscripted encounters between two candidates?
Sure, you get a little bit more of an idea of some of the soft skills that they have in terms of managing a situation, managing a room, the ability to think quickly on their feet, to respond to one another, to be able to challenge each other, and also to get a sense of character that is different from the kinds of ways their polished character comes out when they're doing ads or when they're on rope lines and things like that, when they're really practiced and can control the environment. When they can't control the environment, like in a debate, that gives you a different sense of them as a person and as a potential leader.
There's actually a clip I want to roll here that I think points up what you're talking about. It's from the 2018 gubernatorial contest, Charlie Baker running against Democrat Jay Gonzalez. Baker won easily, but had a very awkward moment in a debate here at WGBH when Gonzalez pressed him on whether he was going to vote for Jeff Deal, who was then the party's nominee for Senate, running against Elizabeth Warren. Let's take a look.
Governor, are you going to vote for Jeff Deal?
Governor?
I'm going to vote for me, and I'm going to vote for Karen Polito, and I'm going to vote for a series of other candidates as well. I don't know what I'm going to do yet with respect to that one.
You don't know if you're going to vote for the guy you endorsed?
I haven't made a decision.
So you're asking people in Massachusetts to vote for Jeff Deal, and you're not even going to vote for him?
I said I was going to support the ticket, and I do.
But you may not vote for the ticket.
I'll make my decision eventually, and I'll make sure people know.
Mike Dean, that obviously didn't do the trick for Jay Gonzalez. Charlie Baker was elected to a second term and has enjoyed high approval marks throughout. Can you think of any moments in Massachusetts debate history that proved decisive? I've been racking my brain, and I haven't really been able to come up with anything, but you are good at this sort of thing.
No, I mean, nothing really comes to mind. I think that we've learned more about Massachusetts politicians when they run for higher office. I think we've probably seen more of Elizabeth Warren on the presidential debate stage than we have, in Massachusetts for her Senate races here. John Kerry before that, any kind of Massachusetts politician that gets that level of exposure, we learn a lot more about them. And, like we're saying, it definitely sets the character and it gets that point across in a more personal way. And that's what a lot of voters want to know. They, aren't really desperate for policy points and plans as much as they want to know what this person's all about and how they introduce themselves. And that's why these campaigns try to control it so much.
All right, Tammy V. Hill, Mike Dean, thank you both. That's it for tonight, but please do come back next week, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the interim. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, and you can find me on Twitter. I'm @RileyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.